be here. I want to thank Walter and the Humanities Center for the opportunity to be a resident scholar. Indeed, it was in conversations with the other resident scholars who were we junior faculty at the time, and now we're doing things like chairing the language and literature department. I'm thinking of my friend Dan Duggan. But in fact, Walter himself was a mentor in helping me to think about how to develop successful academic centers. And I'm grateful to him for that and for his continued friendship and support. Today's title really owes an apology to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Love in the Time of Cholera, and so I extend an apology in that direction. I want to talk about primarily about the bankruptcy and the ways in which it connected to thinking about citizenship in Detroit. You'll have noticed from Professor Edwards' introduction that I am a very well-trained historian in 18th and 19th century U.S. history. So for all of you who know more about the contemporary world than those of us who've been buried in dusty archives, I will look forward to your comments afterwards. I am planning to revise this into a longer essay and am considering a book. If you throw rotten things at me at the end, then I'll judge the book perhaps too ambitious. But I will begin. This was originally drafted and revised for a conference at the University of Potsdam on the changing meaning of citizenship. Once the driving force of American manufacturing and a vast city of 2 million residents in 1950, Detroit's economy crumbled, and now barely 670,000 residents dot 140 square miles of land, approximately. 50 years of economic and demographic decline, combined with the withdrawal of state financial support and opaque, outdated, and sometimes corrupt city operations, found the city financially insolvent and unable to deliver basic city services. Many street lights went dark. All the street lights did not go dark, as some of the media had it. An inadequate police force patrolled inadequately. Buildings burned as short-staffed fire department and a dispirited citizenry looked on. In the face of massive unemployment, underemployment, and poorly paid employment, citizens worried increasingly about survival more than citizenship, about mass incarceration and poor transportation than holding officials accountable for those failures. In December 2011, the treasurer of the state of Michigan asserted that the city of Detroit was in a state of probable financial stress, whereupon Governor Rick Snyder appointed a committee of 10 citizens to review the city's finances. I would point out among the 10 was President Emeritus of Wayne State, Irvin D. Reed. 3 months later, the committee reported that Detroit was indeed in severe financial stress, And in April 2012, the Detroit City Council approved a consent agreement, an agreement that promised to overhaul Detroit's finances. The council's inability to fulfill the terms of the agreement led the governor to order a second financial review, and in March 2013, I'm going through some of the chronology here because in the wake of all the changes, how things happened when blurs. The governor concluded in March that the city could not pay its bills, and he appointed an emergency manager, Kevin Orr, to govern the city. On the 16th of July in 2013, emergency manager Orr concluded that the city was in fact insolvent, could not pay its bills, and recommended bankruptcy. This would be the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. 3 days later, U.S. bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes was appointed to oversee the case, and he in turn appointed the chief of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, Gerald Rosen, as the lead mediator. There are lots of Wayne State connections here. I would point out that that in addition, Eugene Dreiker, who recently stepped down as a member of the board, was a lead member of Rosen's team in working out the ultimate agreement. The filing appeared to mark the triumph of neoliberalism, a term not commonly used here in the United States, but becoming increasingly so. Neoliberalism, how do you like that? A definition just pops up on the screen, which I'm not going to read to you. I put it on the screen so you could read it yourself. Critics of neoliberalism, at least two writing on the website Corp Watch, characterized neoliberalism succinctly: the rule of the market, cutting public expenditure for social services, deregulation, privatization, and elimination of the concept of the public good. The filing seemed, in fact, to confirm the worst fears of neoliberalism's critics. The distinguished geographer Jamie Peck wrote, "The fiscal change managers still have the wind at their backs, and this is continuing to drive new rounds of public dispossession and political incapacitation. The grip of fiscal technopolitics appears to be tightening. This is leading to the further automation of restrictive fiscal regimes of governance, insulating local financial decision-making not only from protest politics, but from the formal political arena itself." You could tell with the added R on arena that I am indeed from New York. Nowhere is this more vividly exposed, though, than in Detroit, wrote Peck, which in March 2013 finally fell victim to a long-threatened fiscal takeover, courtesy of expanded emergency management powers assumed by the state of Michigan, usurping local political control over finances, voiding municipal contracts, and paving the way for further downsizing and privatization. In effect, Detroit's encounter with bankruptcy marked an important milestone in the development of what Jason Hackworth called the neoliberal city. To critics of neoliberalism and to neoliberals themselves, the bankruptcy was a morality tale. For conservatives, Detroit's greedy and powerful public service unions extorted obscenely large pensions that the city, indeed no city, could afford. Bankruptcy would allow the city to shed public unions, shrink bloated pensions, and minimize the city workforce and the reach of city government. To critics, powerful, greedy, and ideologically committed neoliberals used austerity fiscal policies of the states in their rejection of counter-cyclical Keynesian policies to drive Detroit and other cities near or into bankruptcy with the goal of destroying the heart of the shrinking labor movement, destroy public sector unions, and more broadly, eradicate the public sector itself. Yet the story of Detroit's bankruptcy and the experience of citizenship, by which I mean memberships in communities, we should have entitled this book, The Meanings of Citizenship, I think. They suggest that the story was a lot more complicated than either side imagined. The appointment of an emergency manager to govern the city of Detroit, of course, challenged long-standing theories of political citizenship in contemporary America. The right of citizens to participate in their own governance disappeared. Elected officials stood on the sidelines while Kevin Orr wielded power. Major changes in how the city council was constituted, which may have long-term consequences for the governance of the city, at the time barely made a ripple in the political waters. Nor did the presence of Mayor Dave Bing and then the election of Detroit's first white mayor in nearly half a century, again, barely influenced what was happening in the governance of the city. The emergency manager permitted the mayor and city council to do some important things, but it was ultimately dependent on his sufferance, not on any constitutional authority. Standing by, first Dave Bing, then Mike Duggan, and I would say a very capable city council was there to offer advice, but their consent was irrelevant. Gary Brown, a leading city councilman, embodied the shift in power. He resigned from the city council and became Orr's chief deputy, embodying the dramatic shift in power in the city. Critics denounced the emergency manager's takeover as the termination of the political rights of Detroit citizens. Bishop Edgar L. Van II, who was pastor of the leading Second Ebenezer Church and a civic leader of long standing in the city, placed the threat to democracy in a broad historical context when he said, "These are very, very sensitive issues, especially for African Americans who have seen voting rights abrogated both in the past and currently. One city pensioner, Cecily McClellan, promised, "We are going to the streets." They planned for 20,000 protesters, but no large protests ever materialized. Former councilwoman Joanne Watson painted a bleak picture for Detroit and its citizens. The bankruptcy, she said, has clearly been crafted in a right-wing playbook to seize assets, dismember electorate voting powers, dismantle unions and the families, neighborhoods supported by union jobs, disable local elected officials, smear and tarnish the image and viability of black elected leadership, and broadly claim that the legacy costs related to retiree pensions are largely to blame for the city's debt crisis. It is certainly true that the appointment of an emergency manager and the initiation of the bankruptcy process stripped Detroiters and the city of authority. Yet many people reach different conclusions about its impact on effective citizenship in Detroit. It's probably in light of my quoting Joanne Watson, former councilwoman, that I should turn to a former councilwoman with a different perspective, Sheila Cockrell, who now teaches in our honors college. She challenged the idea that Detroiters had lost much at all in the emergency manager's takeover of city government. She observed that the people's rights to safety, services, health, and well-being had already been lost. So in her view, the temporary loss of the right to appoint officials democratically was worth it if it led to the restoration of those other social rights and the ultimate restoration of democracy. In effect, Cockrell was asking what was left of citizenship without the fundamental pillars of what T.H. Marshall once called social citizenship. Cockrell spoke for many. As Detroit passed through bankruptcy, most major participants sought to navigate a path to restored social citizenship, that is, the public good, the reinstitution of the fundamental compact of government and citizen, while minimizing financial pain inflicted upon retirees, protecting the city's treasured art museum, more about that in a moment, the Detroit Institute of Arts, of course, and laying the groundwork for a growing economy. The result would be very different from what neoliberalism's critics feared and its advocates desired. This challenge to neoliberal principles and practice was made possible because Detroit's bankruptcy threatened the city's iconic Detroit Institute of Arts. There is an exceptionally fine history of the art museum by our colleague Jeff Apt in the Department of Art and Art History. Since 1919, the city had owned the museum, and as the Motor City flourished, so did the city's treasury. And almost unique in the history of the relationship of cities and their museums, the city itself purchased numerous important works of art for the DIA. Many of those works had appreciated significantly in volume and became potential bargaining chips in the bankruptcy. Viewing the DIA's collection as the city's greatest asset, and creditors had the collection, all of which was owned by the city, and many of its major works were actually purchased by the city, evaluated with the potential that they could be seized and sold. As journalists writing for the Detroit Free Press observed, the museum believed it was fighting for its life and that selling even one painting would cause donors to flee, push county officials to cancel regional tax support for the museum, and force the museum into a death spiral. Otherwise, they weren't the least bit worried. The struggle to save the museum, I think, was crucial in taking Detroit in a different course through the emergency manager process, which has failed maddeningly throughout the state. That was editorial comment. The struggle to save the museum led the chief mediator, Gerald Rosen, to ask Mariam Noland, who heads and was really the founding head of the Community Foundation of Southeastern Michigan, to gather leaders of the major foundations with deep interests in the city of Detroit. It included names familiar to all of you: Ford, Mott, Knight, Hudson Weber, Kresge, Kellogg. A fairly large number of major national and international foundations with roots and connections to the city. Rosen proposed that national and local foundations, the state and the DIA, would all come together to create a fund to ease cuts to underfunded pensions. That new fund would be used in lieu of selling DIA masterpieces. And as part of the deal, the DIA would be cut loose from city ownership, forever shielding its artwork. Crucial to the participation of foundations in what ultimately became known as the Grand Bargain was in fact the fate of the DIA. The threat to sell any of the DIA's paintings was perceived broadly as a mortal threat to the great museum itself. Foundation support would replace the sell-off of the museum's great and valuable works of art and would be used to minimize the impact of the pension cuts on the city's retirees, not to repay bondholders. The support of retirees was essential, for their rejection of the agreement would scuttle the so-called Grand Bargain. When Wayne State University's Professor Emeritus, Professor of Chemistry, Paul Scapp, a distinguished chemist and a generous philanthropist, when you leave the building, you can walk over to the A. Paul Scapp chemistry building. When he learned of the foundation's discussions, but before there was any agreement, he led the way personally with a $5 million contribution to the Grand Bargain in the making. None of us, he said to the Free Press, want to see individual people hurt and lose pensions. I think if we have to sell even one piece of art, it will so demoralize people in this metro area that we can't even imagine it. foundations agreed with Paul Scout, and they offered to contribute nearly $400 million, not a penny of which would go to bondholders. At the same time, efforts to resolve the city's vast debt to bondholders faced surprising opposition from the bankruptcy judge. Neoliberals had long expected and had their expectations warranted by the behavior of bankruptcy court judges throughout the country in basically supporting the interests of bondholders over cities. The Judge Rhodes, however, did not fit this mold. One financial deal stood out, an incredibly convoluted agreement that had been celebrated on Wall Street in 2005 with a deal-making award for former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick. This was the deal of the year. And in some ways, I think we could indeed call it maybe even the deal of the decade. The city was, but not in a good way, the city was already devoting 5% of its entire general fund budget to pay off this one horrendous deal. So in light of such negotiations, when the mediators came back to the judge with an agreement that the city would pay 74% of the bond debt and that the remaining 26% would go to retirees, the judge rejected the agreement. He told negotiators that he would not approve a city payoff for the $290 million debt that the city owed Bank of America and the other international bank, UBS. He insisted on a lower figure, and the next agreement proposed $150 million, and to which the judge in effect said, "You're not listening." And the final agreement was for $85 million, saving the city's taxpayers some $145 million. Other creditors fared less well. The Financial Guarantee Insurance Company, which was owed over $1 billion, accepted 13 cents on the dollar. And a piece of valuable waterfront property that no one else wanted to buy, the Joe Louis Arena, and the other giant creditor accepted a similar agreement, including extending its lease on the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. The governor extracted $100 million directly from the DIA itself, and then I think quite remarkably persuaded a very reluctant Republican legislature to approve a $195 million contribution to the settlement. Because, and I think the motivation was not exactly all altruistic, but because the Michigan Constitution explicitly protects pensions of government workers, the legislature would place the state itself in financial jeopardy if it failed to contribute to the resolution of Detroit's bankruptcy, because if the retirees refused to accept the settlement and sued in court, the potential was there for the state's obligations to skyrocket. I think success also depended on the fact that city retiree pensions were, by most standards, very small. I was going to say minuscule, which is $19,000 a year for an average for many of the retirees who were not eligible for Social Security, was paltry indeed, with pensions going up to about $33,000 for police and fire. As our law school colleague and bankruptcy expert Laura Bartell observed, you're talking about people who gave their lives to the city. They're living on this thing. What's going to happen to them? This is a very serious emotional, political, and moral issue. Emergency manager, or threatened a loss of up to 34%, though the grand bargain was an agreement that cut less than 5% from the pensions, but also included a loss in cost of living increases. The retirees, like the state, decided to vote for the agreement. As Shirley Lightsey, the president of the Retirees Union, said to her members, you can't eat principles, and uncertainty doesn't pay the bills. She urged them to vote for the agreement at slight loss rather than deal with the uncertainty of a lawsuit, which could possibly make the pensions whole, but also could lead to their complete loss. The impact of the bankruptcy, oh boy, I thought I had a short paper here, on the city and its citizens was deep, yet many of Professor Peck's fears proved unfounded because, I would argue, the city of Detroit had two unlikely champions in Kevin Orr and Stephen Rhodes, two unelected men who effectively came, in my view, to represent the citizenry, or manage the bankruptcy process with an eye toward restoring city services in the post-bankruptcy era, and Judge Rhodes sought to cushion the bankruptcy's impact on the city's retired workers and to insist that any bankruptcy plan must lay the conditions for Detroit's revival and the restoration of city services. This was not intended to strip the city bare. The Free Press called Orr a supremely capable champion of the city's residents, and Rhodes, I think, explored in his final comments on the settlement the meaning of citizenship in post-bankruptcy Detroit. You can hear what he thinks about his remarks later today. There's going to be a discussion of the bankruptcy a year later, moderated by Free Press editorial page editor Stephen Henderson, and the judge will be there along with Mayor Duggan, and I didn't see who else was going to be there. We have used the phrase the grand bargain to describe the group of agreements that will fix the city's pension problem. That description is entirely fitting. In our nation, we join together in the promise and in the ideal of a much grander bargain, It is the bargain by which we interact with each other and with our government, all for the common good. The grander bargain enshrined in our Constitution is democracy, and it is now time to restore democracy to the people of the city of Detroit. Even neoliberal critics of the city refuse to blame unionized workers for driving the city into bankruptcy. Randy Richardville, the majority leader, said that Detroit city workers ought not to be punished for their years of hard work for the city. The collapse of city services and the appointment of an emergency manager, the very shattering of the social compact between the citizenry and its government, forced Detroiters to reconsider their relationship to government, to the city government, to the state. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich attributed the bankruptcy of Detroit to white flight and the economic segregation of metropolitan Detroit and the metropolises throughout the United States. Buried within the bankruptcy of Detroit, he wrote, is a fundamental political and moral question. Who are we? And what are our obligations to one another? Detroiters answered in a variety of different ways. Shirley Lightsey concluded that the bankruptcy meant that citizens of Detroit could only rely on themselves to be the masters of their own information, she said, and of their own assets and debts. Writing in the then local, now defunct Michigan Citizen, the recently deceased, sadly gone, activist Grace Lee Boggs wrote, "Ask any Detroiter about the future and you're likely to hear two things. First, it's clear to us that no one can save us but us. If we're going to have a city that is productive, safe, and joyful, it will emerge from the neighborhood level as people struggle together as citizens," that's my addition, "to find new ways of living. We are learning to make a better way out of no way." Yet others sought to revive the compact between the government and its the citizenry. The Reverend Andre Spivey, a city councilman for District 4, answered Reich's question differently. As we move through this, we'll make sure everyone is included and no one is left out of the process as we welcome new people and new business. Bill Nolan, Kenneth Orr's spokesman, addressed the issue in a different way a little bit earlier when he said, as the bankruptcy transpires, it can seem far off to people in the neighborhoods, but we're actually doing things that people can see every day. Their comments are reflected in many ways in today's city council and in the relationship of council members to their constituents. For a generation, Detroiters had elected members of the city council in at-large elections, and they were often determined by fame rather than competence. One can think of Martha Reeves, who was indeed the great lead singer of Martha and the Vandellas, but who was utterly clueless in the halls of the city council. Or the choice of Monica Conyers, who got there on the name of her distinguished husband, John Conyers, and left the council to do some time in public service in the jail, in the correctional system, having received accepted bribes in the sewer scandal. A change in Detroit City Charter apportioning representation on the council among districts gave city council members close ties to neighborhoods and opened up opportunities for greater diversity. One district elected its first Latina, former Wayne State academic staff, Raquel Castaneda Lopez. And if you follow the social media discussion that's grows out of the Detroit websites, City of Detroit websites, there is intense, frequent communication by electronically and in person in the districts. The consequences, though, are greater than one person's election. As columnist Rochelle Riley observes, most of the city's 7 city council districts are working. Residents are holding district meetings and decided what they need where they live. As part of the effort to rebuild trust in the city government, I'll never rebuild trust in my ability to keep track of the time, the mayor established a city community engagement office in the Informational Technology Services Department. This is the first time I ever remembered to advance a PowerPoint slide in any presentation that I've given. It's really pathetic. The commitment was to one of the essential pieces. I was hoping that would be bigger, but it's blurrier. I'll be happy to share it with you. You can see it more clearly here. Okay. More seriously, what it represented, though, was the recognition that transparency was essential to successful democracy, and that the very, I was going to say opaque, the word I used before, but obscured practices of the city before had made knowledge about what the city was doing almost impossible. And the Socrata Foundation, hoping to be part of Detroit's recovery, funded the establishment of Detroit Open Data with the goal of making it accessible and then connecting more broadly civic technology throughout the city. And as you can see clearly, this is a rendering of civic technology entities in the city of Detroit and how both the major spots of the big colored dots and how they interacted or may in the future interact with one another. If you go up there closely, you'll see a lot of the lines, in fact, are not yet a fully developed network, but the potential is there for that to happen. What's missing, I think, and this is editorial comment, is the potential for this to build regional collaboration, because technology does not logically end at political boundaries. So anyway, the idea of this portal that would open up the city and then connect civic technology around the city holds out the potential, and how that develops, whether it develops, will be, I think, crucial in shaping the way in which citizens in the digital age both understand and connect to the government. It also gives them, the biggest focus right now has been on making all the information about land and land ownership accessible. Indeed, the city has tackled the huge problem of vacant land through the Detroit Land Bank Authority. One of the great sources of conflict, for example, between the city government and its residents had been the inability of homeowners simply to buy vacant lots next to their homes, side lots. And now the Land Bank Authority, which controls roughly 50,000 foreclosed and vacant lots, it may not be that it was 50,000 when this summer, I'm not sure about the number right now, but they've been selling side lots for $100 a lot. As the mayor said, reflecting on neighbors' demands, people want to put gardens next door, they want to put a swing set next door, they want to fence off a lot because people have been dumping tires. It gives people control over their own neighborhoods. It's very exciting. Recently, the Land Bank Authority also began auctioning off vacant but livable homes. Some 325, only a small fraction of the vacant homes, but a start, have been sold, and they have now been leasing vacant lots for $25 a year, so that at least in spaces where block clubs have approved of the sale and the plan of use. So what we're beginning to see are at least efforts at engaging neighbors in the control of their own neighborhoods. The city just a few days ago, it was in Sunday's Free Press, announced plans to collaborate with the Greening of Detroit and neighbors to establish green and blue spaces in the neighborhoods with the expectation that these environmental investments will pay major economic dividends for the residents. The new investment in the vacant Herman Kiefer medical complex purchase opens up the potential for a major development and rehabilitation of vacant houses on the near west side. Notice I haven't talked a word about downtown and midtown, all of which you know. But the Kiefer Medical Center would be the first major development outside the city center. And the Kiefer complex is one of the areas that will be receiving this green and blue investment. The success so far of the Land Bank Authority, and there are more examples of what they've done. I want to leave at least 1 minute for questions. The development of more transparent government, the emergence of a civic tech ecosystem, the positive benefits of electing city council members by district provide some grounds for optimism. It's too early to tell how Detroiters, whether Detroiters will have their faith in government restored, but we do know that the city has literally illuminated many neighborhoods that had gone dark. The urban core, not long ago a near empty shell. Please, for those of you who are around in downtown or in Midtown in the 1980s, know that you could roll a bowling ball down Woodward Avenue on the weekend and not hit anyone. Now you'd hit more than a strike on pretty much any time. And all the development of Midtown to the east of here to 75 was all vacant land when I arrived when I was 12. I get younger as the presentation goes on. Occupancy in downtown and midtown hovers over 90%. Detroit, according to one bankruptcy attorney, had proven that bankruptcy can be an occasion for civic engagement. Although his remarks were aimed at those who contributed financially to the grand bargain, they might well be applied to the city and its residents. There are a lot of questions out there now. Will the neighborhoods benefit from all of this? Will the experience with an emergency manager undermine popular faith in democracy or re-energize Detroit citizens? What will happen to political participation in the near, medium, and long-term future? Will land use policy benefit Detroiters or quicken loans? We know that just recently, a new investment in rehabilitation where the Home Depot is conducting the restoration, those houses that sell for the cost of the rehab. It will go back into a loan fund originally started by Dan Gilbert. And the loan fund will make up the difference if it doesn't reach that level. Will Quicken Loans get the benefit of the potential of a large market? Sure, but that means Detroiters able to inhabit also inhabitable restored homes. So these have the potential to move in a variety of different directions. I apologize for going on. I have become consumed by all of this. And I would appreciate, it's even past 1:30, I will stay for as long as anyone is available to talk. I will be happy to talk with you offline. I'm supposed to be revising this for publication, and so I'm here now, and I appreciate your patience with me, and do apologize for going on for so long. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments?
I need for you to speak up
Yeah, yesterday there was
a little loud. I believe it or not, a little louder.
yesterday there was an excellent presentation that was given by Dr. Spider. And one of the cuts that she made in her presentation was looking at an economic community, and she focused essentially on gender. Okay, and African American gender in that regard.
Right.
All frankness, I believe that your presentation would be enhanced if you were to take a secondary look at the impact of the African American community in connection with this. Because a lot of the restoration and the things that we're talking about clearly is not going to benefit the African American community. It will be interesting to see how developments in the land bank and opportunities for revitalizing neighborhoods and all of those things square within a situation where there's a flat labor market, and particularly a flat labor market for African Americans, where if you were to give the logic of the presentation and say these people will move forward, there's no economic income that's going to support their participation in this economy. So I mean, I would appreciate it if there was more of a focus, because part of what you asked for earlier was kind of like a little bit of feedback.
Sure.
So I think,
Well,
I mean, there's some other things, but principally that one.
yeah,
Because
let me respond, because I think you've raised what is one of the fundamental questions. Are we talking about the emergence of two Detroits? A well-to-do.
Consolidation of it, you know, drawing off.
Well, there had not been many white residents in any neighborhoods of Detroit, certainly not in the urban core. But the real issue is whether this is going to benefit only, or whether, as I raised the issue about the Kiefer complex, which is not intended, whether it turns out to be or not, I don't know, obviously, gentrified, it clearly opens up possibilities. All of the neighborhood housing, I don't think that any of this is going to solve the Detroit economy or the flat labor market. I don't think that that access to housing will do that, but access to reasonably priced, decent housing will improve the lives of Detroiters, most of whom are African American. Will we have will we have two Detroits? Or what you call the consolidation of two Detroits? Well, that remains to be seen. The mayor, I know, has a commitment to build some 100,000 jobs in the city in the next 5 years, which is maybe just pie in the sky. But the question is whether there are businesses coming in, and whether in fact they're hiring. And I think that, and we're also talking about metropolitan area that has suffered, though hardly in the way that the city has. So I can't predict what's going to happen with the economy. I think that that there have been some job benefits, job improvement in the city that includes, not exclusively, but includes African Americans. We're talking about a city that went through economic decline over a course of, I said half a century, but it's more than half a century. I don't expect that this all of a sudden turns things around in any way. All I'm saying is that I think it opens up the possibility of turning things around in a way that going through bankruptcy in other ways would have been far more devastating. I don't see it as a solution.
Just one thing. If it's possible, could you leave a copy of your speech I would like to engage you in what you asked for earlier on.
Sure.
And give some more substantive reactions or comments on things. You know.
M.Kruman, Kruman, at wayne.edu.
Okay, you're gonna post it. Okay.
And
You're gonna post it, or you want me to contact you?
I'm not sure I want to post it. I might be willing to share it with you. I'm leery only because I'm changing my mind every day, and I need to respond to criticism and feedback like yours. Jeff?
I think there are two kind of interesting pieces to your presentation. The first piece is the question of what does it mean for a citizen to live in a bankrupt city? And the second is, was the outcome of the process that we went through good or bad? I actually kind of think the first piece of this is maybe the more interesting element of it, of the implications of living in a bankrupt city. And what strikes me is that in the 1930s, during the Depression, the city was insolvent and at one point defaulted on its debt. It, in effect, went bankrupt. But at the time, there was no mechanism for the city to go bankrupt. Individuals could go bankrupt, but cities could not. The mayor at the time was Frank Murphy, and what he did is he formed, I think it was the National League of Cities, to bring together all the big cities that were having similar issues to lobby Washington, D.C. to create a law that would allow the city to go bankrupt because they didn't know what to do. And so I think there's the possibility for you to take advantage of your historian skills to go back to that period and to think about what does it mean to live in a city that's insolvent and can't go bankrupt. People are going hungry, and instead of feeding the hungry, they had to pay the banks. They compared that world with the one we just went through. And I think there's potentially a really interesting storytelling.
That's actually excellent. It's a very good point, and I think if this becomes a book, that in effect we have two separate chapters. Yes.
Two things.
Students, thank you for coming. Who gave you bonus points? Nobody.
You mean not your students?
I thought this was a line you were coming to shake my hand. I'm sorry.
Sorry, two questions. Number one, I admire the way that you looked at the whole issue of democracy and citizenship. And what was, on one level of analysis, the suspension of democracy in getting through the bankruptcy. But when you bring in the whole issue of technology, I find that's really fascinating because the technology itself, to use your metaphor, reinvigorates citizenship so that people discover they have a voice now using a smartphone or connecting to the ecosystem. That you
Potentially.
Yeah, potentially. But you know, look at all the metaphors that can be affected by that. Empty lots, which is a complaint that people have about Detroit. But with the deconstruction that technology catalyzes, the deconstruction of our understanding of politics, the political process, then these are not simply empty lots, but they're possibilities, empty possibilities. And citizens are claiming, you know, the empty lot next door, I want to use for my purposes and not be a space for junk. So you have a process of deconstruction as well as reconstruction and reconfiguration through technology. So what appears on the surface to be negative, bankruptcy, in fact, opens up possibilities for new ways of participating, new ways of being and new ways of inhabiting social space in our society. Second thing is the work of Jane Jacobs, Death and Life of Great American Cities. That's a really incredible book dealing with the issue of the relationship between violence and architecture. And she has New York City as one of her, you know her work. Yeah, so there she's studying New York City, Lower East Side demographically, similar kinds of people. What's the difference in the two streets? Well, on one street, she says, the street is anonymous, and it's an anonymous thoroughfare. Nobody knows anything. Nobody hears anything. On the other street, it has eyes. So people are aware of who is on the street. There's vitality in the street. There are people who see not an anonymous street, but a street that they participate in. And therefore, there is that potential for violence goes down. She does the same thing with Boston on the North End. So I think you're suggesting also that connection too. When people feel like a kind of ownership, they feel like they can express their voice, express their point of view. That means that people have agency. You know that I can say something and affect some change here. And that, to me, is the beginning of something that may be very remarkable, may be the beginning of a renaissance. Or yeah,
Right,
there's always
I mean, see, thank you.
I got 3 points.
Point one.
First, picking up on the speaker was the one before, I thought that his characterizing the two issues was wonderful, and your talk mostly about was it a success and such, and much less about during the time. And yet the headline, the heading was citizenship in the time of bankruptcy. And I am sort of intrigued as somebody who wasn't even in the country for the whole period as to what did happen, because you went into a world where you had a city that was governed by two benevolent dictators in a way, and so you could ask, what did happen to civic engagement? Is there any way that you could sort of find out whether people who showed up at whatever, school board meetings or local meetings, or is there any way to sort of measure what did happen to the citizenship engagement of the normal people when suddenly they were being governed by these two benevolent dictators? And I don't have a clue, but it's certainly a fascinating question, and that actually is what I thought the talk was going to be about. So that's
Sorry.
point one, is you might think
Otherwise, you
about that.
wouldn't have come.
Yeah, it's a great one. The free cookies and the coffee, I thought was always good.
Well, and Walter's.
No, so that's
street
one,
work.
is it's a fascinating thing. You might, if to the extent that you can talk about it, that's great. Second, it's fascinating to hear you say, and again, I wasn't here, quoting all these people who saying this whole thing is an outrage and it's a scandal and democracy's being destroyed and it's a terrible takeover by total bastards and such. And yet you said, quote, no large protests ever materialized, closed quote, which raised all sorts of lovely questions as to whether those people who were bashing it, in fact, were not speaking for the citizens, and your Sheila Cockrell plays on that, but it was sort of a fascinating thing as to are the people who allegedly were speaking for folks not actually speaking for citizens, and was there any sense of, so who knows? That's a second point. And the third and last point is...
Let me just jump in there, and then you can get to three.
All right.
Because
I might forget three, though, if I don't get there quickly. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's okay. I mean,
Yeah,
if you've
go ahead.
asked two tough points, then I'm
Yeah.
protected. First of all, Kruman June in the political science department is doing she and I were talking yesterday, she's doing some work on the impact of the emergency manager on political participation. But I think it's an open question about, and definitely I will have to dig deeper to see if it changed during and after, and whether in fact there is deeper or less engagement. I know the ACLU recently has been seeking a study that presumes a certain outcome, the way in which it's framed as,
No.
did it depress, did the emergency manager depress voter turnout? As opposed to what was the effect
Yeah.
on, if any, on turnout. The second thing is that I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that just because 20,000 people didn't show up, that meant that people approved of the emergency manager. I think that what you can see in the city had been at least a recent history of disengagement. Not that there weren't significant
before this?
community activism, but also a lot of disengagement along the way. So I would not, a lot of people who don't vote because they don't care. They also don't vote because they're disgusted with the system and walk away. So some of those, certainly 20,000 who didn't show up to March may have been felt that, what's the point? That is apathy or
Professor,
repudiation may have.
there were two processes going on in the city at the same time, which again I direct your attention to. One was the Detroit Works Project, which held a series of meetings across the city for almost a year or better, which had in its citizen participation was in the range from 300 to 500 people every time that they met, which I think would be a good way to kind of judge this question of citizen concern and or participation. The other one was the process, and I know I participated in this directly. I was the executive director for the Charter Revision Commission, and we rewrote the city charter during this period of time. And part of the vehicle that we used in rewriting the city charter was about, I think it was close to 50 or 60 meetings and all over the city of Detroit, where we took citizen testimony and so forth around the aspirations, if you will. We got a lot of criticism, but around the aspirations on how they wanted to see the city reorganized and so forth. And even in our meetings, we had anywhere, I think the lowest participation in one real outstretched area was about 50 residents. We reached a high, I think, in one of our meetings of about 600 individuals, okay?
Do you have the documents that came out of, I mean, presumably you took and synthesized?
Yes, and we collected and we turned everything over at the end of the period to the Detroit Main Safety Library, so the Ruther Library would have this information, as well as the Detroit City Clerk in their archives, okay? We had some 600 recommendations that came out of that process, where citizens specifically said that they wanted this, that, and the other, okay? So I think in one sense, to shape the narratives around the media-identified spokespeople, be it Cockrell or whomever, is probably not, I think, a good feel of what actually occurred during that period of time, okay? And the other thing is, I don't know how we square this question of the significant role in which the land bank is taking place, is dealing with, in the context where we have a Wayne County treasurer who are foreclosing, you know, thousands and thousands of homes. You know, where one was arguing what, a corner lot versus the disenfranchising of families across the board. I mean, you know, the last auction had 30 or 40,000 homes in it. This is not the first auction. This is kind of like
Well, the
3 or 4 auctions in.
Remember, we're talking about a new county treasurer, where the reason you're seeing a flood now is that the the former treasurer had resisted the foreclosures.
No, this is,
My
no,
third, my
that's not
third
true.
point, remember what, my third point.
Third point.
Yeah, my third point, before I forget my third point, is that from your perspective, I would urge you to think about doing a little essay ruminating about the conundrum of a democratic system that, at least apparently, utterly failed with ending up with contracts such as your one that Mayor Kilpatrick entered and such. And then a system where you have ruler by two completely unelected officials, and then rich people working in a grand way to do grand things in a way that at least some people think worked out reasonably well. And someone from your perspective, I would think, ought to do a little bit of ruminating about what does that tell us in terms of anything? Does it say this was a one-off sort of thing, or does it say that it'll never happen again and democracy will work beautifully from here to the end of time, and non-democracy doesn't? Or I don't know, or who knows? But it's such a striking sort of a set of operations that a book talking about citizenship, you think, would have a little bit of philosophical reflecting about that. Now I'm going to shut up.
Great idea. Thank you, Steve.
So Sarah was first. Sarah was.
So just a few comments, and I don't expect any, you don't have to come back with them, but earlier in your talk, you had made this really interesting point about transparency and how that helps facilitate successful democracy. But because I study an authoritarian state across the world, I see transparency as legitimation, not necessarily leading to democracy. So it creates a level of legitimacy even if those behaviors aren't democratic. And so I would just suggest that we don't want to necessarily make that leap, although it seems easy to do in this context. But I've seen cases where transparency just gives the government legitimacy to do whatever it's going to do. And so I wouldn't necessarily suggest that it enhances democracy. So the technology issue, right, isn't necessarily going to
I thought your point there was that it was necessary, not that it was sufficient.
Well, I think it's necessary, but it's necessary for democracy. It's
Yes.
right, but but then I think that needs to be a stronger statement, because in some folks would argue that that it wasn't sufficient, and so you didn't end up with a strengthening of democracy in this.
And technology in this instance, also, the question becomes, it's a real strange game of winners and losers. Technology in this particular instance advances essentially a group to which there's a lot of criticism about gentrification. Who's going to take advantage of those types of things? That's a real question.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Well, I was also curious about, I think the other part, when we're talking about the economic part of the development of Detroit, was when you talk about downtown, you're talking about influxes of large numbers of young people, and what that has done. You've got, you yourself mentioned the gentrification that is happening, and you've got large numbers of wealthy white people moving in, and they're sort of imposing a whole new structure on the people who have been living for a long time, saying, we're going to show them how to do it now. Then you got the influence of people like Dan Gilbert, who are both political and economic powers in the city. And when you talk about the technology, I agree that it's sort of a reinforcing this another kind of social class having a sort of a quiet influx, and the people on the bottom. And when you talk about the people who are not voting, a lot of lower class people don't vote because, what I've read, it's not because they don't feel part of the system. It's just that they just don't they aren't accessible, they don't have any access to power. So,
Well, there
Okay,
are a lot of
wait,
reasons
I'm
why
gonna steal
people
the
don't.
table back. I didn't finish, no offense or anything, but being a woman, I feel like, I'm gonna assert to finish my, sorry, I said, I have one other point that I definitely wanted to get out there, and the rest I can forget about, but I really felt like your analysis of neoliberalism was very interesting, but I felt, my take on this is that neoliberalism has been ravaging cities across the country for a long time, and that this was the body slam, right? So just analyzing this one point without that longer context, and also this very hidden element of, and you said it, the museum is no longer a part of the city. That is the sacrifice. The city has been, the city is sold off. It's being sold off and not quite privatized, but put in these institutions that separate it out. And it's so key to this process of citizenship. So you're a member of a community that's being stripped of its assets, its resources, its symbols, its, and so the water, the bridge, the museum, the parks, I mean, all of this is going and being distanced from this community, at least in certain ways. And that, to me, seems like quite a success of the neoliberal agenda in many ways.
I don't agree.
Okay.
I don't agree. I don't agree on a variety. I mean, yes, I realize that this is susceptible to different kinds of interpretation. Yes, Belle Isle is no longer, is leased by the state, but Belle Isle right now is used by a very diverse population in the city that had been avoiding it. The support for the DIA, which has been a regional support, and which has enabled greater use by students in the Tri-County area. The idea of city ownership was, as Jeff App's book points out, was very unusual and an almost unworkable situation. The alternative was selling off the DIA. I don't think that these remain different kinds of public places. And I realize they're not owned by the city. And I followed the debate closely over Belle Isle.
And you don't think that's changing the community to which we're a member?
I think it is, I think that,
Change for the better.
I think it's actually, what I'm saying is I think it's benefited the community. And
So you're picking soft landings. You're picking soft landings. The fact that the city of Detroit does not have a health department, for example, okay? How do you square that in terms of this kind of thing? If we had big headlines about the possibility of what is the virus, what was the name of the virus that was?
Norovirus?
Not noro, but whatever, one of these big viruses that was going to really kind of, the notion was it was going to wipe out populations. It wasn't swine flu, but that's another one. You could use any of these, okay, right? How does a city protect its citizens when the city of Detroit, for example, does not have a health department? The current relationship in the city of Detroit in terms of health is that it's privatized, okay? In that privatization, no private individual can go out and use their police functions, because they don't have police functions. Government has the police function, and force people to take the necessary shots, to do all the necessary things to protect the public health, okay? How do we square things like that against this kind of rosy view that this stuff may have, that there are some winners, particularly citizen winners, in this particular kinds of things. So you can pick Belle Isle, that's
I
fine.
didn't pick Bella.
Well,
Not you, the
No, I think
individual.
it's
Not you,
across
the
the board. I
individual.
mean, there's a huge list
You know.
of this process that's happening.
You know.
Yeah.
I mean, this, at some point, there is this question, and I would have, what I came to hear, I thought, especially as a historian, that you were gonna put the questions of cities, American cities within the side of a broader context, and talk about, realistically, with the impact of deindustrialization and other kinds of things in which all scholars basically, agree has occurred, then talk about how could the city, using Detroit as an example, how it's going to lead, if you will, this next challenge or formation of the American city, Because, I mean,
Well,
that's.
I think there's been a huge amount written about deindustrialization and the decline of the city, and I by no means thought that I was in a position to add to that discussion. It's not, I think that we have tremendous amount of work by historians. Sarah's talk yesterday followed important trends, not necessarily in deindustrialization, but in the reduction of public spaces with the decline of the beauty salon. So no, what I was interested in was Detroit. I'm not denying that things have happened elsewhere. I'm not claiming to be a historian of urban bankruptcy, nor am I, and I by the way, I was amused and pleased by having advice about history coming to a historian from a political scientist. It was absolutely a gem. Thank you. And a good point too, not just that. So no, I'm not trying to explain the city. I'm trying to explain how leaders, ordinary citizens, experience the process and what the consequences are. And so in effect, it's two steps in discussing citizenship, as Jeff pointed out. So no, I can't tell you about. I will be exploring issues of public health. I'm actually involved in a project on citizenship and health right now, and that we're beginning in the city. And do I see certain positive things happening in the city? I think it's hard to avoid seeing some positive things in the city. Neither of you see them. I don't.
That's not true. No, that's not true. Don't say that.
Hold on. This has been, just a minute.
The reaction was.
You didn't have to stay. I didn't even know you were here, Walter.
The reaction was your balance. The reaction was your balance, not whether or not myself and I don't want to include Dr. Swider, but myself, whether or not I don't see positive things in the
Right,
city.
I don't think I said that either.
Right,
Well, this has been a quintessential brown bag talk. If we could have had a better way of ending it. It's not ended yet. I mean, this is just going to be the official wrapping up. But the whole idea of the brown bag series is to provide this opportunity for people to exchange ideas interdisciplinarily. There's a historian, there's a sociologist, there's a political scientist, there's an urban scholar here, there's an artist, there's an English scholar, all contributing ideas. And I couldn't have wished for a better ending of this series for this semester. So let's give Mark a hand of applause. And then you can go after him a bit.
Yes.
I can take a hit.